Um, let's see, where do we find Paul this week? Oh, we're almost finished. Paul is going to be on his way to Rome, is he not? It's tiring as I've been reading through this since we've been on here for the last year, started last June. Paul's been on several trips. He's been on 3 missionary trips, correct? And he's been going, he did a lot of trips with boats, and we're going to see Paul head out towards Rome this time. It's not a missionary trip. I guess you could say it is a boat trip. Some people believe that Paul had 4 missionary trips because they kind of figure he went to Spain, but we can't argue that one right now. But he's headed to Rome. He's in chains. He's been through Felix, he's been through Festus, and he's been through King Agrippa, and he is requested to see Caesar. And what we're going to do is we're going to start sailing for Rome in this journey. And these are the events that Luke writes about Paul's journey to Rome, including the shipwreck and his arrival at Malta. Now, when I say that Luke wrote about this, Paul's events, we are still in a we type situation that Luke is writing, so that must mean that Luke is with him on the ship, okay? And that we are starting the journey to Rome. But before we dig into the verses, I would like to offer a prayer. So, Father God, thank you so much for allowing us to come here today. Thank you for allowing us to see how your word has been given back in the time when people needed it, that it was at the right time, at the right place, and that you use this time to spread the gospel. That we have the infrastructure and technology today to spread your word further as Paul's spreading your word through his chains. We ask that each one listen to your word and let the Holy Spirit talk to your heart, each heart to help him with application. In Christ's name I pray, amen. Okay, so on verse 1, so we're going to do verses 1 through 12. In verse 1 it says, when it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some of the prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. Okay, this centurion, Julius, was very highly regarded. And they handed over Paul and other prisoners to him. He was in charge of them on the ship. We don't know how many other prisoners, but we know that this ship is huge and it's pretty big. Now, verses 2 through 12, or verse 2, when we had boarded the ship, when we had boarded a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go see his friends to receive their care. Okay, so when they put in at the port there, Julius had allowed Paul to leave and go see his friends. So obviously, Paul has made a good rapport with Julius, and that he allowed him to go see his friends without being guarded by Julius, and that they were going to be putting out to sea. So he checked in as much as possible. Now, I think that it doesn't say this, but Paul is being guarded by Julius, and Julius is with him quite a lot. So can you see Paul standing next to Julius talking about Jesus and talking about how much help Jesus was to him and about the gospel and about how he's a savior? So anyway, we go on to verse 4. When he had put out to sea from there, we sailed along to the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After sailing through the open sea off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we reached the Myra and Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. Sailing slowly for many days, with difficulty we arrived off Cnidus. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salome. With still more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Okay, now you notice here in verse 7, they sailed to the south side of Crete. Okay, they wound up coming into a port there called Fair Havens. Now, Fair Havens was a port that was to the south side. It had no jutted edges, so they are right there where the sea is. And now we're talking about when they arrived there, they had to download or unload all of what was there. It was a grain ship, so they were going to unload grain, and then they were going to load more stuff back onto the ship because it was going on to Italy. So, verse 9. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous. Since the Day of Atonement was already over, Paul gave his advice and told them, "Men, I can see that this voyage is headed towards disaster and heavy loss, not only for the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." Okay, right there in verse 10, Paul gives his first warnings. Paul is going to give 4 warnings here. Okay, and his first warning is he predicts that there's danger if the ship left Fair Havens, Crete, because it's down in probably sometime in the middle of October-ish that they left, and it's really dangerous, really wind. So you notice that come September through December, the East Coast has their hurricanes, and that's where they come in. It's about the same type there, that they have storms, and that usually when they get those storms, they should stay from September to February before they set back out to sea, because it's dangerous. Unfortunately, they're at Fair Havens, which has no block from the wind, okay? So they could sit there. It wouldn't be so bad for the people to stay on land there. The problem is the ship would get battered and probably sink right there in the port. So what they've decided to do was, let's see, where am I? Cargo ship. Verse 11. But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to Paul and said, "Since the harbor is unsuitable for winter," and the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. So by going from Fair Havens over to Phoenix, what that did is it was a little jet like this, and it could go in, and it would be safe from the different waves coming in. Those sides would catch the brunt of the waves, and the ship would be okay to sit in there. But Paul said we shouldn't go. And then what did the centurion say? Centurion said that it was okay because the captain and the owner of the ship must have been on board as well, because the owner said it's okay to go. So the centurion listened to the experts instead of to Paul, which we find later that is going to cause a large problem. Okay, so in verse 13, when a gentle wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Okay, now to do that, you have Crete, and he's sailing along below the bottom. Fair Havens is here. Phoenix is here. So what they're going to do is they're going to sail along the shore, supposedly, and catch Phoenix, and that's where they're going to winter. And they had a nice little wind behind them, and the centurion's probably sitting back and said, "See, Paul, just calm down. Everything's going to be okay. We're going to make it on to Phoenix." But what happens here? 14, but before long, a fierce wind called the nor'easter rushed down from the island. Now, does anybody know what a nor'easter is? A nor'easter. That is one of the worst storms that I've ever seen in my life. It comes in from the north and it blows into the east. And I have never seen storms they just pummel, right? And that's what happened. The storm came in from the north and east. It came down over top of the land of Crete, and all that and it hit the water, and it just hit the ship. Now, the ship is sailed. It's not by any power but wind, okay? So now the wind is coming in and pushing the ship away from the shore, okay? So they're not going to make it. They've got to try to go into this wind to get to the shore, and it's not going to happen. So since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. They're in a position now where they have lost all control of this boat. They can't do anything. No matter what they do, the wind has them. Because they made a poor decision. Now this boat is just taking off, and they're doing everything they can to control. But for some reason, every time they try, they just can't do it. Can you see that? Can you see how that parallels life? Okay? How we try to take control, and no matter what, it starts spiraling, and you can't hold on to that control. You can't do it. Everything starts off great. I got an idea. I start moving towards this direction, and I don't seek God's advice. And we start off good, and then all of a sudden, one bad thing leads to another bad thing, and then we spiral out of control, and we can't hold on to it. Okay? But here's where we go. Here we're going to go and find out what happens to the ship after it spirals out of control. So after hoisting it up, the skiff, and used the ropes and tackle and girded the ship, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because they were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. For many days neither the sun nor the stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that they would be saved. See? Just like we do. They tried everything. They jettisoned all their money, okay? The money on the cargo on the ship, they started jettisoning that, throwing it off. It was weighing them down too much. They threw out an anchor, a drag anchor. What is that for? That's to keep the ship from just moving every which way. They tried to find a way to get control of that ship. And they said that they would use the drag anchor, okay? But the only thing that does is set you up and slows you down, but the wind still has you, and you're in some type of straight mode, but you're still out of control. Because you had no control of where the ship is going. It's going with the wind, okay? And they said finally all hope was fading that they would ever be saved. Verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, you men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain damage and loss. Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of our lives, but only of the ship. For last night an angel of God, the God that I belong to and serve, stood by me. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God was graciously giving you all those who were sailing with you. Take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just this way, and it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island. All right, Caesar's giving them another standing up and sort of taking charge. Not Caesar, Paul's sort of standing up and taking charge now, okay? Paul predicts that no one will die, but the ship would run aground. But he also says here that that they're going to appear to Caesar. Now, Paul was going to Caesar to begin with, okay? God said Paul was going to Caesar, all right? So, if God gives you something that says you're going to do this, it's going to take place. It will take place. It may not be the way you think it's going to take place, but it will take place. Paul is going to get to Rome. God told him he was going to Rome. Okay? And what he's done here is he's told these men here that he's going to Rome and that God has graciously given them the people with him. Okay? So, not everybody there on the ship knows about Paul's God, I'm sure. Okay? I'm sure Paul has tried to talk to them, but we're talking there's 276 souls on this ship. Okay? And this ship's been tossing. They haven't eaten. And his God said, or our God said, that you're going to go, Paul, and you're going to make Rome. And everybody is with you. But not everybody worships this God. But these people, these passengers are blessed because they are with Paul. Do you see the connection there? Do you see the connection to you as a believer? The people around you that you come in contact with, they are blessed because of you, because of Jesus through you. That's something we need to keep in mind, that when we meet somebody, that they are blessed by God through us. And that we can only pray that we can bring Christ to them. Okay? Verse 27. When the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight the sailors thought they were approaching land. They took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. When they had sailed a little further and sounded again, they found it to be 90 feet deep. Now, a sounding is all that is they're taking a piece of rope that they know the length of it, and they're dropping the weight down until it hits the bottom. And then they measure the rope. Okay, so they know they're headed towards land. And it's dark still. So it's 14 days, right? Then 29, then fearing we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. So here it is, 4 anchors are on the stern. They didn't want to run aground, but Paul said what? They're going to run aground, right? And the ship is still pushing towards the land, and it's pulling these anchors. I mean, the anchors aren't working very good. Now, some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put anchors from the bow. Really, if you're going that way, why would you put an anchor that way? It doesn't make sense. But anyway, but Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff to let it drop away. When I think of this, what do we think of? I think of the movie Titanic. Okay? And now the Titanic was going down, but what was some of the first people to get into the boats? Well, according to the movie, the first people were the ship's crew. Okay? Well, that's what's happening here. Is you got the ship's crew, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, it's going to be bad." So they're trying to drop the small boats to jump in it, so they don't run aground and leave. Now, if they do that, who's going to man the sails? Who's going to man what the boat needs? Who knows how to do that? So Paul's telling the centurion, "Hey, if they leave, we all going to die." Okay? They need to stay on the boat so we can all survive. And that's what they did. Now, that's another prophetic thing of Paul said, okay? Paul said, They need to preserve the lives of the passengers. 33, when it was about daylight, Paul urged them to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day, and you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head." Now, that's kind of funny. Did they fast? Were they fasting? Or were they trying to save food in case they ran aground? Or this is kind of things that I think of when I'm reading this. Yeah, I really don't think they were that hungry in the sea, in the storms, okay? I don't think they could keep the food down. But I think that's what he's doing now. We need to strengthen ourselves. God's going to put us on some land. We're going to go in and we're going to do what we need to do, okay? We're going to get our lives saved. So after he said these things, he had taken some bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them and broke it. He began to eat. They were all encouraged and took food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard in the sea. So they're still lightening the ship. Why would they lighten the ship like that? Well, I guess their lives are better than to save the grain. But as they lighten the ship floats higher in the air so they can get to the shore, and it won't hit the ground before then. But finally, daylight came. 14 days and they finally have daylight, okay? So when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted the bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. When they hoisted the foresail in the wind and headed for the beach, but they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast, remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul, and so he ordered those who could not swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks and some on debris from the ship. And this way, everyone safely reached the shore. So the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners. Why did they want to kill the prisoners? Because what happened to the soldiers that guarded Jesus' tomb? Jesus disappeared. They were going to kill those soldiers for they disappeared. So these prisoners were worried about getting to Rome eventually and finding out that their prisoners escaped, and then they would be killed because their prisoners are gone. But that's not what Paul said. Paul kept talking about, we're going to make it to Rome and everybody will be saved. And the centurion is listening to Paul and now is telling everybody, you're going to make it. Which, the more you think about it, the more the centurion is starting to leave the expertise of this world and move towards Paul's God, listening to Paul and his prophetic messages. Okay? Because he said now, everybody's going to survive. So they finally make it to shore. Now, this shore is Malta. Now, I want you to understand this, okay? They were supposed to go about 5 miles. All right? They were supposed to go from the Haven, Fair Havens, and they were supposed to go around to Phoenix, which is about 5 miles-ish. All right? But now they've been shipwrecked on Malta. They have no idea where they are. None. Okay? They just know that there's land there. Okay? That means that between Fair Havens, Crete, to Malta is about 500 miles. They went in 14 days in that storm. And they didn't have control of anything. Nothing. Who controlled that boat? The wind. Now, did God control that boat? They were with the wind. I'm just throwing that out there. So let's just move on and see some other things here. 28. Once safely ashore, we then learn that the island was called Malta. The local people showed us extraordinary kindness. They lit a fire and took us all in. Since it was raining and cold, as Paul gathered a bundle of brushwood and put it on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself to his hand. Then the local people saw the snake hanging from his hand, and they said to one another, "This man, no doubt, is a murderer. Even though he has escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." So they see this viper hanging off of him, a poisonous viper. And they've not a lot, and the people in Malta was like, "Oh man, this guy, he's going to get justice. He escaped his death in the sea, but God's going to get his death on him in there." And he threw it off. Now, when it said it fastened himself to his hand, okay, this word is that, I mean, it went in deep. And Paul had to shake it off really hard to get it off, okay? So he really got bit. I mean, he got a good venom in him. And he shook it off back into the fire, okay? But he shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no harm. They expected that he would begin to swell up or suddenly drop dead. After they waited a long time and saw nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Okay? Now, there's a lot of times in the Bible where people drop down to worship angels or other people in the worship them as God. And they're like, "No, don't worship me. I'm not God." Now, Paul said he's not God, but he's in Malta. God has somehow put him in Malta, okay? And he let them know that he wasn't a god, but he said, "Okay, well, I'm in Malta. What do I need to do?" What does he do? He ministers, does he not? It says here in verse 7, "Now in the area around the place was an estate belonging and leading to the leading man of the island named Publius, but welcomed us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Publius' father was in bed suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went to him, and praying and laying hands on him, he healed him. After this, the rest of those on the island who had diseases came to him and were healed. So they heaped many honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed." Notice Paul didn't leave any handkerchiefs back for people to. But he healed many people there. But did he heal them? No, this was Jesus through him. This was what was given to him to do. But afterwards, after spending about 3 months there, they finally made it to Rome. After 3 months, we set sail in an Alexandrian ship that had wintered at the island with the twin gods as its figurehead, putting in at Syracuse, and stayed 3 days. From there, after making a circuit along the coast, we reached Rhegium. After 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and the second day we came to Puteoli. There we found brothers and sisters and were invited to stay a week with them, and so we came to Rome. Now the brothers and sisters from there had heard the news about us and had come to meet us as far as Forum of Appius and the Three Taverns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier who guarded him. Okay, so Paul seems to be a model prisoner here, right? So he's with guard, but the guard's allowed to let him have time. They finally made it to Rome. So what does that mean? That God came through and got him to Rome. Not the way he wanted to go, but that's how he went. And what did he do in the meantime? He ministered in Malta, which brought others to Christ there. Okay? So let's look at 5 takeaways from this. 5 takeaways. God said, "You're going to Rome," right? Okay? And they were in the ship in the storms. And the ship, even though they lost the ship and everything on it, that everybody was, saved. They were saved because they told Paul he was. And they were blessed because Paul was there on the ship with them. So, takeaway number 1, God's sovereignty and protection. God's sovereignty and protection. God's in charge of all, and he protected Paul to get to Rome. Okay? That's what we see here in this passage. Number 2, Paul had faith. Paul had faith and perseverance. Okay? Paul stood up and he tried 4 times to tell them about the ship and about what was going to happen, and nobody listened to him, okay? But he had faith and perseverance in God. He continued to put his faith in God that they would make it, okay? So that means, we need to hold on to our faith and persevere through difficulties, knowing that God is faithful and will see them through, okay? Faith and perseverance. I want to talk about somebody else that went through some ship problems, okay? Somebody that made voyages on ship quite a lot. Okay, this man was John Wesley. Okay, John Wesley went between the Americas and England quite a lot. John Wesley was a preacher and a theologian. John Wesley was, I guess in America, he was the beginning of the Wesleyan Methodists. Okay? And he preached and he knew Jesus. But there was this one trip he took in about, in the 1736, I think it was, with in the 18th century. But he was on this ship. And the ship sort of did the same thing that was going on with Paul. There was a bad storm and the ship was going horribly wrong. And he was scared. He was doing everything he could to help himself, okay? But there was somebody else on that ship from Germany, all right? There was a group of Moravian missionaries on that ship. They had no fear whatsoever in their face. None. And he looked at him and they go, in the midst of all this, we're about to lose our lives. And they're sitting there just as fine as could be. They had faith in that ship. And this right there, John Wesley wrote, was his conversion experience. Okay? He realized at that moment what it was to have faith. Or as Adrian Rogers says, faith above sea level. Okay, sea level. You can't see it, but you have faith in it. Okay, and that was his conversion experience. So you need to have faith and perseverance, and that's what they did. They had faith and perseverance. Takeaway number 3, divine intervention and miracles. Divine intervention and miracles. God is capable of performing miracles and intervening in our human affairs. Doesn't say how he does it, but he does it. He'll get you where you need to go. And sometimes it requires a miracle. And you don't even know it's a miracle until you look back. And then you realize what he did. He could have done a lot of things differently. Okay? What was the miracle here? He said he was going to give him the shipwreck. And he said he was going to get him to land. He said he was going to get him to Rome. He also said that all the souls on the ship were going to survive. Okay? But what miracle was it here that he intervened with? That viper should have killed Paul. The venomous snake. They were looking for him to immediately swell up and die. I mean, it's one of the, like, you ever heard of the two-step viper in Australia? It bites you and you're lucky to make 2 steps and you're dead. Okay? So, I mean, this viper bit him. They were expecting him to fall over, swell up, and die. Okay? And he didn't. So that was a divine intervention and a miracle. And it was also a sign, if you will, about how powerful our God is. Now, I'm sure we can think back and little things happen in our lives and there was little interventions. I can tell you right now, I'm here today because of one of those little interventions. I should have died, but I'm here because of a miracle. That was number 3. Number 4, witnessing and evangelism. So number 1, we have God's sovereignty and protection. Number 2, faith and perseverance. Number 3, divine intervention and miracles. Number 4, witnessing and evangelizing. Witnessing and evangelizing. Okay? Paul had 3 missionary trips. They were purposely done for missionary and evangelizing. This was not a missionary trip. Okay? This was a trip to get him to Rome to see Caesar. But what did he do while he was going out and doing that? See, this should encourage you as believers to boldly proclaim the message of Christ, even in difficult times. Okay? Even in difficult times. Difficult times actually provide you more of a witnessing opportunity or an evangelizing opportunity than the great times do. Because if you're going through something and your faith has you strong, people look at you, how do you keep your head up? It's my God. So witnessing and evangelizing in these times. So we have number 1 is God's sovereignty and protection. Number 2 is faith and perseverance. Number 3 is divine intervention and miracles. Number 4 is witnessing and evangelizing. Number 5 is providence and purpose. Providence and purpose. It's God's providence and His purpose to be where you are. We need to trust that God's providential guidance puts us where we're supposed to be. And we have to acknowledge that He has a purpose for us even in a chaotic or an unstable time. His providence, all things work together for His good. Okay? All things work together for His good. I'm sure Joseph did not want to be put in a pit and sold into slavery. I'm sure he didn't want to be in prison in Egypt. But because of what he did, he became the second in command and he saved his whole family, which was the lineage all the way back to Abraham. Okay? He saved that. God's purpose and plan for you. When I was in seminary, one of the best stories I heard from my president and what it did to keep me going is he was in Dallas, going to Dallas Theological Seminary. Okay? His name is Danny Aiken. Okay? And he stood up there and told us that when he was going through his master's degree, he was a pastor of a church. Now, he said the church was going off a little biblically, and he was trying to hold it straight, and they let him go, okay? And the only thing he could do was find this job in trash removal. And there was these big dumps you would call, and he'd put a big dumpster behind a building. Well, the people that called that dumpster company put it there, and they filled it so much full of just trash, junk, spoiled things, everything you could think of. And he said it was piled high and it was overflowing, and they wouldn't pick it up, and they blamed him for it. And because of what it is, they told him that they're going to put another container behind there, and he was the one that had to put all that trash in there and even it up in the containers. So here he is in July, and he's standing there, and all this gunk and junk and the smell and he's picking up trash and moving it from one dumpster to the other, and he is upset, and he says he's really got it in there, and he's talking to God. He said, "Why? I can't believe this. I'm in seminary. I was a pastor of a church, and now you got me doing this," and back and forth. And he said, all of a sudden, this calmness fell over him, and he got the words, well, it wasn't exactly like this, but paraphrasing, "My child, if this is where I want you to be at this time, why would you want to be anywhere else?" So, we have God's sovereignty, faith and perseverance, divine intervention and miracles, witnessing and evangelism, and providence and purpose. You may not know what your purpose is, but I can guarantee you're in God's providence, and you will know your purpose. One more story before we're going to close. Just one more, okay? And I don't like to talk about it, but this is an I story. In 2008, I was working at a job. I had a stroke, and I was paralyzed on my left side for quite a while, for about 3 weeks. Slowly but surely, I started getting feeling back, and I started building it back, and I was working hard. I was working hard, right? I was trying to control the situation. I couldn't feel nothing. I mean, this was just down. My leg was down. I couldn't talk, all right? I couldn't control anything. And I'm like, why? The only thing in my mind was, I need to get back to normal. I need to get back to normal. Between that and 2010, I had 7 strokes. The last one, they finally did surgery and fixed the problem. But in God's providence of putting this on me, okay, my purpose made itself known. And that afterwards, I started having all these young people that had strokes. They started coming through my path, okay? And God used me to encourage them, to encourage these people. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but that was what my purpose was in that situation and in His providence, okay? Because I know you don't think, a stroke is bad. My wife was upset because they had given her information outside the room about suicide. Because most stroke victims, when they lose control, they start thinking about suicide. But I fought back, and I helped all those other ones fight back. And it wasn't me helping them fight back. They looked and they saw me, and they're like, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, it just takes time. It just takes time." And I could encourage those people. And from then on, they started getting better. That was God's purpose for me at that time. And I didn't know. And guess what? Everybody here has a purpose. Right? Sometimes you may not know what it is. And it was Paul's purpose to apparently be in Malta so he could evangelize that tribe of people, or those people. Otherwise, he would have missed Malta altogether and went right on up into Italy. So who did Paul evangelize? The 276 people on the ship and the people of Malta. God's providence, his purpose. And you don't have to be a missionary. This is Matthew right here. Go, therefore, and make disciples. He wasn't on a missionary trip to make disciples. He was going to Rome, but on his way, he started making disciples. You can too. Let us pray.